were under our control, some were not. What was interesting about this as well was the analysis that was made of the nuns that lived in the convents. And certainly one of the conclusions that was drawn from this incredible study of 20 years of looking at these women is that they live lives that have little stress. They share a value system with the other women they live with. They keep in touch with others. They do charity work. They live a life of value, and one in which the modern world does not impinge on them in a particular way. And we believe that this decrease in stress is also a contributory factor to the fact that they have a very low incidence of Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementing disorders. So in addition to eating habits and exercise habits, lifestyle also makes a difference. And when we think about this, even in common sense, we believe that decreasing stress is probably a very good thing for a good life. We also learned at one point that for both learned fear and instinctual fear, we actually have areas of the brain, for example, the amygdala, that are designed specifically to allow us to respond to an acute threat. And so what we have, let's review that. You have information coming in from the sensory systems and going to the thalamus and synapsing either in your lateral geniculate, medial geniculate, whatever the sensory system is. And then the reticular formation is able to shunt that information to a structure which is subcortical here beneath the cortex of the temporal lobe called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the structure that's involved in learned fear and also involved in instinctual fear and the processing of sensory information that has a strong emotional component. And it's part of this quick response system that allows us to respond acutely, you know, the saber-toothed tigers and all that. So, unfortunately, in our modern world, we respond to everyday stressors as though they were saber-toothed tigers. And this system was actually not designed to respond every day like that, or even multiple times a day. So what we're going to talk about in the present lecture is we're going to look at what happens when you have a chronic activation of the system. And it's hoped that this is just going to reinforce what you already know is true, and that is it's important to decrease stress in your life, but now you'll have some real evidence as to why you want to be able to do this. We have learned in neuroscience that chronic activation of these pathways, being under chronic stress, actually damages both the immune system and the cardiovascular system, and now we know it actually causes the death of neurons in the brain. And so that's what we want to cover now. It's increasingly clear and actually part of our everyday knowledge that how we interpret and experience the world emotionally has a profound effect on our physical and mental health. So it's our interpretation of what is happening to us. It's not the traffic jam that's the problem, it's how we respond to it emotionally. And that's true of when we lose our keys and we go in the search frenzy. It doesn't matter what it is, it's how we respond to the event, which turns out to be critical. Remember, in modern neurosciences, we're viewing emotions differently than we did before. Some philosophers view emotions as rational judgments. At the least, emotions help guide us to make good decisions. So now the key is, how can we harness those emotions in a way that in fact does allow them to be useful for making the very best decisions that are in our best interests? So it's interpreting and responding appropriately to stimuli that is the key. So let's review what happens in this system. So we're going to review a little bit that we covered before, and now we're going to try to draw it together when we talk about the kinds of stresses we are faced every day or how we interpret our world every day in our own lives. So here we have, when we're faced with a threatening stimulus, and let's imagine this time that it's actually a threatening stimulus. What happens is we have activation of a part of our brains called the sympathetic nervous system. So this is actually a part of the nervous system which is under the control of our hypothalamus. And you remember our hypothalamus is located beneath the thalamus, and it's one of its functions is homeostasis. So now we're presented with this saber-toothed tiger, whatever, and so we're going to respond, and it's our sympathetic nervous system that responds. What is going to happen is that the hypothalamus is going to, as part of the response to this threatening stimulus, is going to cause the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone from part of the hypothalamus, which is called the pituitary. So as part of the response to this threatening stimulus, how it's interpreted by the brain, our amygdala, we're going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. We're going to have the release of what we refer to as ACTH. So this hormone is released by the anterior pituitary, which lies underneath here as part of the hypothalamus. In response to the release of ACTH, what is going to happen is that above your kidney is a gland called the adrenal. And ACTH is then going to cause cortisol, which is a hormone which is released in response to stress, and that's what we're talking about. Okay, we're going to fight our saber-toothed tiger or flee from him. And it's also going to cause the release from the adrenals of catecholamines. And because the catecholamines are part of the peripheral nervous system in this case, it's going to be dopamine and epinephrine. So dopamine and epinephrine are released from the adrenals. In the short term, these are very useful responses. So when you have this, you have ACTH released from the pituitary, then the adrenals respond by releasing into the bloodstream cortisol and catecholamines. And in the short term, this is very good. This allows us to have a quick response to what's going on. It increases alertness. It stimulates our muscle, so if we decide to fight or flight. And other physiological changes take place that allow us to meet whatever challenge is facing us. So in the acute use of this system, it's very valuable. Now, when the crisis is over, when we've been able to hide from the saber-toothed tiger or we've vanquished him, whatever happens, when the crisis is over, another part of the nervous system, also under control of the hypothalamus, the parasympathetic division, which is the rest and relax, is going to restore us to homeostasis. So the sympathetic system is fight or flight, acute, release in the bloodstream of stress hormone, of catecholamines, and then when that crisis is over, a return to homeostasis. And this is how this system is designed. Now, the problem isn't the acute response of the system. That's what it's supposed to do. The problem is the chronic stress or our interpretation of events in a certain emotional way that leads to a chronic activation of the system that's actually damaging to the body and to the brain. And so what we see is that chronic stress can actually damage the ability of the immune system to fight disease and also damage the cardiovascular system. So there's been a lot of research done on this, and I'm going to summarize this huge body for you and just make sort of summary statements. So let's look, first of all, about what we've learned about what chronic stress, chronic activation of the system. So we never go back to that rest and relax. It's just this chronic stress, chronic cortisol release, chronic release of the catecholamines. What this does, for example, to our immune systems. So when you have these chronically high levels, particularly of cortisol, what happens is that you have a decrease in the body's natural immune response. So the whole immune system is designed in the body to fight foreign invaders, foreign proteins that come in. And this is a very finely orchestrated system. Well, what happens is, nature has devised this in a way. If you're facing a saber-toothed tiger, then your immune system doesn't need to worry about whether or not there's a virus entering your body. You have to survive the tiger first. And so chronic cortisol causes a decrease in the body's desire even to have the immune system work appropriately. And so what happens over time is there's a chronic decrease in the immune response. Also, high levels of cortisol are associated with a decrease in DNA repair mechanisms. Now, what we have is that we're exposed to UV light. We're exposed to things all the time that damage little pieces of our DNA. And we actually have mechanisms in our body that immediately go to work to repair it. And what happens is, again, we don't need that if we're going to be somebody's lunch today. It doesn't matter about repairing your DNA right now. So the system gets shunted to taking care of the stress that's here. But chronic stress leads to chronic activation of the system, which means that individuals show a decrease in these DNA repair mechanisms. Also, there's an increase in autoimmune mechanisms. Now, in some individuals who have autoimmune diseases, what happens is that some part of the immune system goes awry, and their immune system actually sees part of their own tissue as being foreign. So remember, the immune system is supposed to fight off foreign protein, foreign objects. So what happens here is that the immune system goes awry, and it sees some part of your own body as being foreign and attacks it. So there's an increase in autoimmune mechanisms under chronic stress. And that's just because it turns out that autoimmune diseases are very sensitive to chronic stress. And so it increases them. So decreases the normal immune response, increases autoimmune response, and decreases DNA repair mechanisms. What is the consequence of that when you're under chronic stress? Consequences are you're more likely to get colds, you're more likely to get infections because your immune system isn't working the same. You are at increased risk for things like cancer because ultimately cancer has to do with the ability of your body to repair DNA when it's damaged. And so when that is decreased chronically, then you're more likely to get cancer. Individuals who have autoimmune diseases, the one we covered here in our course was multiple sclerosis. So in that case, the individual has autoantibodies that actually attack oligodendrocytes and the myelin sheath around axons. So individuals who have that autoimmune disease, or lupus, which is a systemic autoimmune disease in which people, the immune system attacks tissues throughout the body of the individual, damages the lungs, the kidneys, the liver, the eyes, whatever. Individuals who have rheumatoid arthritis, where the autoimmune response is against some part of the tissue in a joint. All of these disorders have flare-ups when individuals are under chronic stress. So one of the things we always tell patients who have been diagnosed with these diseases is decrease the stress in your life. Well, you know, that's nicely said, but it doesn't mean we're always able to do it. But the reason we have the flare-ups is in fact because the chronic stress, chronic cortisol, is secreted and it causes this response. So obviously, chronic stress does not do good things to our immune systems in general and to mechanisms that are designed to actually protect our bodies. So chronic stress is deleterious to the normal events that take place in our body to protect us. Now let's turn to our cardiovascular system. Damage to the cardiovascular system obviously occurs for a lot of reasons, like the things we eat. We should be careful about that. Obviously, this is very important. But chronic stress also damages this system. So we generally separate the damage which is done in a cardiovascular system into two separate types of damage. So one is called non-ischemic and one is called ischemic. And it turns out that chronic stress causes both of these types of damage. So it's important for us to understand this. So let's look first at the non-ischemic cardiac damage. Non-ischemic damage to the heart means a direct damage to the heart muscle itself. So it turns out that high levels of catecholamines, and in this case, release of epinephrine from the adrenals, which would occur in a chronic way when you're subjected to chronic stress, actually damages the heart muscle directly. How this was discovered was very interesting. What they found was that when NASA, in the heyday of NASA, when they were sending the rockets and spaceships, individuals who were part of the team were under very high levels of stress for a very long period of time. And it turned out that these men had a higher incidence of heart attacks and sudden death from cardiac arrest. And so they were trying to figure out what was going on. And actually, one of the hypotheses was even that the Russians had poisoned the water at NASA. So it was sort of, it was during that time when that would have been one of the hypotheses. So they called in physicians to look. Nothing was found in the water, of course. But it turned out they discovered something. And they were primarily men, the men that were involved in this team, after every launch, about 15% of these men lost their jobs or would lose their jobs. So these men were under chronic amounts of stress for a huge amount of time. And then even when a launch was successful, they were under a sort of chronic stress as to whether or not they'd have a job continue on. And these men showed abnormally high levels of cortisol and catecholamines in their bloodstream. And it turned out experiments later demonstrated that if you provide the same kind of stimulus in a rat, for example, you can cause the rat to have a heart attack. And when you dissect the heart, you see that the heart muscle itself has been damaged. And we believe that it's primarily the epinephrine which is doing this. It's the catecholamine release under conditions of chronic stress. So you can have damage to the muscle of the heart itself when you're subjected to chronic stress. Now, there's also an ischemic damage. Now, you remember from our lecture on stroke, ischemia is when you block the blood supply to a structure. So you can have it happen in the brain, you can have it happen in the kidneys, it can happen anywhere. When you block this to the heart, when you block the vessels to the heart, you have a heart attack. But this would be ischemic because there's been a blockage in the artery leading to the heart. So you can have ischemic damage brought about by a variety of reasons. So, for example, when you're under chronic stress, chronic levels, it turns out, of cortisol and epinephrine under chronic stress actually leads to a scarring inside of the vessel wall. And we now know that in areas where there is scarring of the vessel wall, this is one of the places that plaque builds up. So there's fats and everything circulating in the blood, and this is one of the places where plaque builds up. Also, blood platelets build up in these areas where the vessel wall is scarred. And so what happens under chronic stress is the individual is actually more likely to have an ischemic stroke or heart attack related to the clogging of the vessels that supply the heart and the brain. Now, also remember that development of vascular disease is implicated in Alzheimer's disease. So the same risk factors occur in both. And so this is also something that would place a person at higher risk if they survive the heart attack or survive the stroke, put them at higher risk for the development of Alzheimer's disease. So to summarize just this data, this is a system that was designed to start and stop. It's an acute response system. And under acute conditions, doesn't cause any damage and works very effectively to mobilize us to get out or to fight. And then we're returned to homeostasis. If that return doesn't come, that rest and relaxation doesn't come, and we're under chronic levels of stress, then it causes other mechanisms in the body to not work appropriately and leads again to a variety of things, changes in the immune system, which are deleterious to our health, and also direct and indirect damage to the heart. And so chronic stress is a killer for the body. Now, what about our brains? Because this is sort of cutting-edge neuroscience. This is something that we've suspected for a long time, and now there's definitely evidence to suggest that it's true. And that is that chronically high levels of cortisol can actually induce neuron death in the brain. And interestingly enough, our very structure, which is one of the most plastic areas of the brain, that's involved in so many different of the neural pathways that are important for human life, is the structure of the hippocampus. And it's the hippocampus which seems to be selectively sensitive to high levels of cortisol. And now we think we even know why. It turns out that neurons in the hippocampus have a very high level of cortisol receptors, and they actually bind cortisol. And we're trying to understand why on an acute level that doesn't cause any damage, and that's a good thing. Maybe it mobilizes something about memory in some way about how to escape from this enemy or what to do or how to help us make a decision about what we ought to do. We don't really know what's involved there. But what we know is when these receptors are chronically bound to cortisol, it causes within the neuron, it sets off a cascade of events that actually results in the death of the neuron. And even though the hippocampus is one of the few areas of the brain in which mitosis occurs throughout life, it will not replace neurons that are killed under these circumstances. So it's a very low level of mitosis, but chronic stress kills many hippocampal neurons. And in fact, it kills so many hippocampal neurons that you can see the atrophy or degeneration of the hippocampus with MRI. So you can actually see what we call hippocampal atrophy, which means degeneration. The hippocampus will be smaller. We can actually see it grossly on MRI. Now, we've been looking at different conditions under which this occurs, under which hippocampal atrophy occurs. It occurs in a wide variety of individuals under chronic stress, but the people that have been studied the best and that we're very interested, obviously we want to think of ways that we might intervene in other individuals to help them. But there are different groups of people who in fact show hippocampal atrophy at a higher incidence than others. These are adults who were abused as children. So people who have been abused chronically as children, as adults, can show hippocampal atrophy. Individuals who suffer from long-term depressive illness. So individuals who are depressed over a long period of time which is not treated. Individuals who suffer from prolonged grief that has not been dealt with. These are all circumstances that cause chronic activation of the system, chronic stress. And finally, individuals with post-traumatic stress syndrome. So individuals under these conditions have had some kind of abnormal thing happen to them, which can then lead to a chronic stress response throughout their lives. And this can actually be seen on MRI. Now, it's also true that every individual who's abused and every individual who even suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder doesn't show hippocampal atrophy. I'm going to come back in the last lecture in this course and talk a little bit about this. Is one of the things we need to try to understand. We need to know why in one individual it leads to this and in another individual it doesn't. But nonetheless, even if you can't see it grossly on MRI, individuals who suffer under these conditions, long-term emotional distress caused from abuse or caused from some traumatic event, often show impairment in cognitive abilities and in particular memory. And so it tells us, in fact, we know from our own life, think of yourselves when you've been under some kind of stressful situation. Your memory isn't as good as it is under other situations. And that's because probably your hippocampal neurons are binding cortisol and somehow something isn't working as it ought to. So we think that this really, really does matter. Now, I want to return to what we talked about at the very beginning. And I know that this is sort of a complicated diagram up here, and I try to stay away from complicated diagrams, but I just think it really encapsulates everything we've been trying to talk about. What really matters is our perception of what happens. It's our perception, it's our response to stressful events in our lives that matter. So if we look at this, we see that we are born with certain genetic predispositions. We can't control that. There are genetic factors that play a role in how we respond to life's events. We all know that. We're born with temperaments. We're individual people. And then we also have life stresses that are part of our environment. Some of these we have control over, some we do not. And what happens is, what matters here is the perception or interpretation. And as we develop, we learn coping skills based both on our personality and temperament that might have genetic factors and also on the things we're exposed to in our lives. So we develop coping skills. And this leads to a certain psychological state that we believe is responsible in part for the way we interpret events in our life, the way we respond to events. And if you look at different individuals, you will see that they have patterns of responding to events. Okay? So this happens over a lifetime. This interpretation of what's happening to us is then going to influence the body, because it's how we interpret the events that is critical, whether or not it's perceived as stressful. It's not the stressor itself, unless it's an extreme stressor like abuse or individuals who've been in a concentration camp, something really extreme like that. That's something anyone would be stressed from. But normally that's not true. Normally it's our perception that's the problem. So what I have here is what's going on in the brain. You have our neocortex. We have subjective experience of what's happening in our lives. We have a limbic system that has this emotional elaboration. And the limbic system, the hypothalamus is part of it, is then going to activate reticular formation, autonomic nervous system and everything in an attempt to help us deal with the stress. And it's all related to these factors here. So here again, if you looked across here, here's our limbic system, emotional elaboration, and here's our psychological state. And I would put to you that we have a brain of incredible plasticity. And if we have habits that lead to prolonged stress, and we have a prolonged emotional, negative emotional response to life events, we need to learn other habits. We need to retrain this plastic system so that we don't have those kinds of emotional responses. And over here on this side, I just put how reality is perceived, the ways or choices we have to respond. We have many choices. And remember, that's what emotions are supposed to help us be able to do. They're not supposed to work against us. They're supposed to help us make those choices. We have an emotional thermostat to our personality. Some of it's genetic, some is learned. Some are just bad habits that we've learned. And lastly, we always have the body's response. And so what is important here ultimately, I just want to go back to the very first thing that was said in this lecture about what's important. It's how we perceive the stressors in life that's important, not what they are. And the better coping skills we develop, then the kinder we are to our bodies and our brains. And we have an incredibly plastic brain. So if we have developed poor coping skills or abnormal emotions or emotions that are negative and deleterious to our health, we have the ability to make the changes. We need to learn how to respond appropriately to stressors and to learn coping skills that can maintain a homeostasis for us emotionally and physically. Thank you.